Today we're talking about plant classification. That's just how scientists group living organisms. One way you can group them is by how they reproduce. So let's take a look at some ways plants reproduce. Now, all living things need to reproduce, and when we say that, we're talking about when plants or animals make more of their own kind. So that big tree is going to make another big tree, but how does it do that? It starts off as something small. How do plants reproduce, and do all plants reproduce the same way? Let's find out. Well, some plants use flowers to reproduce. And you can see some pretty flowers on the left hand side you might see in a field, or in the middle we have orange blossoms on an orange tree, or maybe even some small flowers like you might see in the grass. But you might be wondering to yourself, how do flowers help plants reproduce? So if we take a look at this picture here, you can see flowers eventually turn into fruit once they've been fertilized. But how does a fruit help? Let's take a look at this video and see how a fruit helps a plant reproduce. So there we just saw a flower turning into a fruit. And what's inside a fruit? Seeds. And that's how flowering plants reproduce. They use flowers that turn into fruit that produce seeds. So what else? What other way do plants reproduce? Some plants don't use flowers, and we call those plants non-flowering plants. And they're plants that reproduce without flowers. But we have two types of those plants. We have seed-bearing and we have non-seed-bearing. Let's start by looking at seed-bearing plants. Seed-bearing plants that don't have flowers, one example is a pine tree. Pine trees don't have flowers, but they do have pine cones. And I don't know if you knew this, but inside of a pine cone there's actually seeds. And when a pine cone is mature, it releases seeds to make new pine trees. Some plants that don't have flowers but don't have seeds include things like ferns, mosses, and mushrooms. If you've ever taken a close look at the back of a fern, you might have seen these little bumps, and those are actually spores. Spores are used to make new ferns. Moss is another example, and it also uses spores to reproduce. There are no seeds. And here we see a picture of a mushroom actually releasing spores. That puff of smoke you see is not smoke, it's actually spores, and they're going to fly somewhere in the air and make new mushrooms somewhere. So now it's your turn. I want you to answer these three questions in your notebook. Question 1, what do all three types of plants have in common? And by three types of plants, I mean flowering, non-flowering, seed-bearing, and non-flowering spore-producing. Question 2, what do flowering and non-flowering plants have in common? Question 3, what do spores and seeds have in common? Remember, write your answers in complete sentences.